Aloha, this is Keali'i Kukahiko from the Office of Hawaiian Education and a lecturer with the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. The message I wanted to share with you today is really about the ability for Hawaiian education to Pūpūkahi I Holomua, or to move forward in unification beyond the current crises of 2020, beyond COVID-19 pandemic, as we find spaces to work in, to teach, and to learn. I'm in my daughter's playroom. So we're going to start by developing some common vocabulary. If you're already familiar with the Ohe theory of change and ontological frameworks, you can fast forward to about 4 minutes and 40 seconds. And I have provided chapter spaces in case you want to jump to specific sections of this presentation. Ontology is often discussed as a nature of being, or the study of reality. Within our research at the Office of Hawaiian Education, it is both, and there are three components. Axiology, which is the morals and values that dictate how we choose to interact with reality. Methodology, which are the methods and philosophies that are used in the collection of information or data that inform our reality. And these can also be methods of a'o, or the ways that we teach and learn. Epistemology is what we know about reality, and it is with this information or this knowledge that we choose to maintain reality or to change it to better align with our ontological framework. Paulo Freire would call this component our circles of certainty, which can be expanded in learning environments with multiple perspectives, or what we would call makavalu, or constricted as they collide with a singular narrative. In an open ontological framework, then, these three components inform one another, and in doing so allow participants to access all their lived experiences and intersectionalities within their identities as reference points to produce new knowledge. We know that Hawaiian education before the overthrow in 1893 and the English-only law in 1896 boasted a 91 to 95% literacy rate in both English and Hawaiian. Olelo No'eau tell us that this process of a'o was a sustainable model of education with an open ontological framework, where the values of our kupuna were embedded within what we knew and how we knew it. In a closed ontological framework, these three components are isolated and detached from one another in the meaning-making process. In this model of education, a singular narrative exists that creates a dependency on someone else's intellectual property. If you're interested, I've used this lens to self-check my own courses that I teach. Using Jamboard, I create a Venn diagram of an open ontological framework and ask the students to share their values, their circles of certainty, and specific examples of class activities that may have allowed them to inform their own learning within components of their own ontological frameworks. This activity can help you understand how well you are connecting to your students and identify what strategies are best connecting your students to the curriculum. And hopefully the added benefit is an improved sense of ontological self-efficacy, or the student's ability to trust and apply these personal frames of reference to their own meaning making. I also ask my students to engage the Jamboard on a model of a closed ontological framework. Specifically, what methods of teaching and learning in my class do not align and cannot be informed by their own ontological frameworks. Hopefully this can inform the P4 in your own classroom and to help you determine whether there is any misalignment. So if we know that Hawaiian education boasted a 91 to 95% literacy rate within an open ontological framework, what are the consequences of a closed ontological framework? What are the consequences of asking a child to disconnect from the sources of knowledge that inform their sense of being? What are the consequences of asking children and teachers to code switch? Our research at the Office of Hawaiian Education suggests that cultural dissonance has become the most destructive outcome of U.S. compulsory education. Cultural dissonance is this psychophysical trauma caused by the intentional and unintentional forms of cultural racism. This is a process that normalizes the invalidation or erasure of cultures and requires students to assimilate or code switch between the home and campus culture. The Ohe theory of change informs our work. It's the methodology where we use historical investigation to understand why we have the issues we have today, what those issues are, and where we want Hawaiian education to go. That why, what, and where inform educational practices, projects, programs, and policies that we call educational P4, and represents the how we are going to realign and recalibrate the course of Hawaiian education towards that desired futurity. This framework has also been a helpful tool in my classes to guide student research. I challenge my students to research a problem or social issue that is not specifically addressed in our literature, but falls within the purview of our coursework. I ask them to construct a research paper that addresses why, what, where, and how, while providing 5 first-level headings: an introduction, historical context, contemporary circumstances, social change, and a conclusion. And we use this Jamboard to help them conceptualize their storyboard and incorporate multiple perspectives within the development of their narratives. The first question I ask is up in the left-hand corner there. Why do we have the issues we have today? And this particular Jamboard was around the discussion of the sustainability of Hawaii. And the next question I asked was, why was there drift? How did we go from a sustainable to an unsustainable society? Moving on to the what questions in yellow. What are the symptoms that something is wrong? How do we know that we are in an unsustainable reality? And the next question was, what are the root issues? And we can only understand this question by connecting the historical context to the contemporary circumstances. Next guiding question is to the far right. Where do we want to go? And lastly, in pink, the how. How do we get to our desired futurity? Anyways, I hope that helps and provides an example of how you can use this lens in your classroom. It's always cool to see how students synthesize the literature or discussions, and to see them use these discussions as springboards to envisioning new realities. Heo Puni Palapala Kou. Mine is the nation of education. The historical investigation of Hawaiian education in the kingdom provides us ample examples of a sustainable model of a'o, and was inherently connected to traditional sources of knowledge production. A'o was embedded in this intellectual ecosystem from Mauka to Makai, in the Ahupua'a system that continues to be our model of resource sustainability today, and within the Kauhale system where mastery of strengths, internalization of kuleana, and communal sustainability ensured that all knowledge was never stored in the same house. A'o is embedded in relationships, and the cultural practices that connect us to collective memory, and the kuleana to become a link to those intellectual genealogies for future generations. And when the written word was introduced to this intellectual ecosystem, this open ontological framework boasted a 91 to 95% literacy rate. And within that learning environment, learners had a clear sense of purpose because Hawaiians had a firm grasp of who they were, where they were, and what they had to contribute. Our investigation into the mo'olelo guided us to Kekuhaupio. We chose to study this mo'olelo because Kekuhaupio was perhaps the most famous student and later teacher of King Kamehameha I, and so he made the perfect kumu to teach us about a'o. Also, Samuel Kamakau was the author of this mo'olelo that was printed in the Hawaiian newspaper, and he was an educated maka'ainana who became an educator, a legislator, and later a judge. And so he represents the desired outcomes for students today. Some of those include the ability to ground their learning within a Hawaiian ontological framework in order to navigate an ever-changing political, environmental, cultural, intellectual environment, and use their education to create and maintain spaces for Hawaiians to live, think, and dream in Hawaiian. When we dove into the mo'olelo, we found 3 categories of a'o. The first was content knowledge. The second were the tests, assessments, and learning outcomes. And the third were the characteristics of a'o that allowed the content knowledge to deliver the desired outcomes. We found that the content knowledge were connected to 5 traditional sources of knowledge production: aina, kapuna, napilina, ea, and aha. What was fascinating about the tests, assessments, and learning outcomes of the mo'olelo was that they rarely measured what we have come to understand as proficiency today. When we think about what assessments and standardized tests measure today, we're talking about rote memorization and the regurgitation of static content. When we look at the desired outcomes for Kekuhaupio, however, His father, who played a significant role in his education, repeatedly tells his instructors that he wants his son to be worthy of serving his haku with love and loyalty. Ko'aya, Kekuhapio's Lua instructor, was actually more concerned with his students' mastery of the content knowledge. Ko'aya's desired goals for Kekuhapio was that his student not use his Lua skills to oppress, hurt, or harm others, but to use them in the protection of Lahui. If we look at the first test that Ko'aya gave Kekuhapio, it was to jump into the ocean and kill a niuhi, or the man-eating tiger shark, which has nothing to do with Lua, or the Hawaiian martial art. What Ko'aya was testing was Kekuhapio's ability to slow down and assess his enemy, to nalu, or to observe and recognize the important details that would improve his chances of success. Kekuhapio realized that as the tiger shark came up out of the water to bite the bait, it was swallowing large amounts of salt water. And so Kekuhapio waited. He waited for the niuhi to become engorged and sluggish before jumping in and killing it with his spear. Ko'aya also wanted to test the courage of Kekuhapio, but not in the same way as we think about courage today. I have seen football coaches yell at their players to go out and hit someone as an act of courage. But what Ko'aya was looking for was a confidence in preparation, that Kekuhapio would trust the process that his father and his collective kumu had designed for his preparation, that he would trust the process and protocol he had prepared for the offering to the akua of Lua at the heiau before the test, and that he would have confidence in his preparation and ability to apply his knowledge creatively to achieve success in unfamiliar contexts. We know this process was intentional and purposeful because Ko'aya's final two tests for Kekuhapio sought the same desired goals and outcomes. In the first, Kekuhapio had to defend against a move Ko'aya had never shown him before. But still, against Ko'aya's secret move, Kekuhapio had to creatively apply what he had learned to escape the hold. In the final test, Kekuhapio had to defend against a binding weapon that he had never seen before. This weapon is called the ikoi and is used to bind the limbs of an enemy. As Ko'aya attacked Kekuhapio with the ikoi, Kekuhapio realized he could use his staff as a third leg. By keeping his staff 6 to 12 inches away from his body, the ikoi would wrap around the staff of the spear and his leg, providing him enough slack to easily step out and avoid the bind. And Ko'aya quickly realized he was not going to bind his student. And so it was Kekuhapio's turn to bind his kumu with the ikoi. From the brief experience of defending against the ikoi, Kekuhapio integrated the skills, techniques, and strategies he observed his kumu use against him moments before to develop his own unique style from which he successfully bound his teacher. The third category are the characteristics of A'o that inform us on how we can use content knowledge to deliver the desired goals and outcomes. There were 4 major characteristics of A'o: Nalu, Hana, Malama, and Awamo. Nalu is the observation, reflection, and recognition of a desired A'o outcome. Hana means work and represents the transition from recognition to action, or application of knowledge. We see with the eyes, and now we got to work with the hands. Malama means to care for, and characterizes the steps that teachers and learners take to create multiple supports and sources of learning. This can also be the opportunities that we provide our students to position themselves within their own learning, allowing them to connect their experiences and apply learning to the benefit of a collective. Awamo is a stick used to carry burdens and represents the internalization of kuleana to master one's craft, and to pass that knowledge on as a way of feeding future generations of a collective. With so many examples of A'o best practices, an unprecedented achievement of academic success by all global accounts, why did educational drift occur? Educational drift is the degree to which the Va'a of Hawaiian education is drifted off course. If you're not familiar with the events listed here, I suggest reading Uncle John Osorio's book, Dismembering Lahui. It will help you to understand each of these singular events as processes, and collectively the development of intentional and purposeful systems meant to sever Hawaiians from traditional sources of knowledge production. So what are the symptoms of cultural dissonance and educational drift? Today, only 35% of NHPI students in Haido met proficiency standards in language arts, while only 25% were proficient in math. This is significantly lower than the 91 to 95% literacy rate in the kingdom. The four racial groups that have maintained the highest rates of suspension in Haido are all Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders: Hawaiian, Samoan, Micronesian, and Tongan. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students in Haido have the largest gap in college aspiration versus participation. That means while 78% of these students want to participate in higher education, only 45% actually enroll, which equates to a 33% misalignment with Haido's largest student population. The student discipline data in Haido for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders exactly replicate the arrest and incarceration rate of adolescents in Hawaii. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are the only group whose representation increases as they matriculate through the legal system. Their representation within the student discipline data and within the adolescent arrest and incarceration rates exactly represent their adult incarceration rates. And this data suggests that there is an active and sustained school-to-prison pipeline. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students in Haido have the highest rates of suicide and suicide attempts in the United States. And in several studies that investigated this phenomenon, cultural dissonance was a higher predictor for suicide by Native Hawaiian adolescents independent of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and psychopathology. So what are the root issues within our contemporary circumstances that create and maintain an unsustainable Hawaii? First, foreign interests have created the highest cost of living in the United States, and it depoliticizes Hawaii by pushing Hawaiians into the diaspora and making it unaffordable for them to move back, while increased land taxes continue to push Hawaiians off of Aina. The education system produces CTE and CCCR curriculum that align with market needs and reproduce an unsustainable Hawaii. Since the major industries of tourism, construction, and the military do not require college degrees, the current definition of academic success constructs extractive pipelines for educational and professional trajectories outside of Hawaii. As Hawaii became the state with the highest unemployment rate in the U.S., the COVID pandemic exposed what most of us understood as major flaws in the dependency on foreign interests and the importation of 90% of our food. And what is it about U.S. compulsory education that is so resistant to change? What is so important to U.S. compulsory education that it protects the narratives of a necessary evil, white man's burden, manifest destiny, and the melting pot?
Mount Rushmore on July 3rd, you said that we face a far-left fascism in this country, and then you said this.
Our children are taught in school to hate their own country and to believe that the men and women who built it were not heroes, but that were villains.
You said our children are taught in school to hate our country. Where do you see that?
I just look at school, I watch, I read. Look at the stuff. Now they want to change. 1492, Columbus discovered America. You know, we grew up, you grew up, we all did. That's what we learned. Now they want to make it the 1619 Project. Where did that come from? What does it represent? I don't even know.
It's slavery.
That's what they're saying, but they don't even know. They just want to make a change. Cancel culture. I hate the term, actually, but I use it.
But are they teaching
cancel
people
culture.
to hate America?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Look at the professors. Look at what's going on in the colleges. If a conservative goes on a college, and look, we have as many as them. Excuse me. I think, to the best of my knowledge, we're sitting at the White House, and the Oval Office is right behind me. We have as many as them. But
who's them?
The liberal, radical left. We have a radical left destructive ideology, and it's being taught in our schools. And don't act like you're surprised to hear this. There are books written about it. And we can't let that go on. We can't let them change the true meaning of what we're all about. And that's what they're trying to do. And I don't want it to happen. Not on my watch. It's not going to happen on my watch.
So how do we change? How do we recalibrate the current trajectory of Hawaiian education and realign our course towards a desired futurity? Strength place, and cultural-based educational P4 are the practices, projects, programs, and policies that develop common language, relationships, readiness, and movement through interest convergence. These P4 represent how we can correct for educational drift, reconnect to traditional sources of knowledge production, and shift our education from a closed ontological framework to an open and sustainable model of a'o. The desired futurity represents where we are going, and include the constellations that let us know whether we are on course, have gone adrift, or have arrived. This particular futurity was developed with Haida stakeholders, but I suggest that you and your community stakeholders or your classroom engage in this exercise for yourselves and determine where it is that you are going within the specific context of your kaya ulu. Here is a Makavalu exercise I use with my students to help them understand cultural dissonance and the processes and systems that have severed Hawaiians from traditional sources of knowledge production. Makavalu literally means 8 eyes and is a desired outcome of a'o to understand the world through multiple perspectives, to find the kauna and allow for multiple meanings to coexist at the same time. This exercise uses a deck of playing cards to represent 5 traditional sources of knowledge production that inform one another within an intellectual ecosystem. Each suit represents an ahupua'a, a sustainable model of a'o. After introducing each component, I ask the students, why are each of these components important to the sustainability of Hawaii? Most often the students will tell me that they would need to destroy the system so that Hawaiians depend on them, the conquerors, for knowledge. When I ask them how they would do that, they tell me that they would take their land, their language, and make it illegal to perform those cultural practices that connect them with old ways of knowing. Here is how the illustration of this exercise works. If my high school students can hypothetically come up with effective colonial strategies to shift sustainable models of civilization into dependent colonial territories, then thousands of years of practice can perfect this system of change. Please close your eyes for a moment as I read a mo'olelo from a Kenyan scholar. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement and makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It makes them want to identify with that which is farthest removed from themselves. For instance, with other people's languages rather than their own. Possibilities of triumph or victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, a collective death wish. Amidst this wasteland which it has created, imperialism presents itself as the cure. What images came to mind, and how does that mo'olelo connect to a larger collective experience? How does that mo'olelo connect to you as an educator? What are the ways that your work has severed yourself and your students from traditional sources of knowledge production? And conversely, how does your work reconnect or connect you and your students? Ohei's investigation into the negative and undesirable student outcomes challenged the claim that economic advantage was the highest predictive indicator of academic proficiency and student representation in the disciplinary data. Take the achievement gap in language arts between NHPI students and non-NHPI students in Haido, for example. The largest gap is between low SES NHPI students and high SES non-NHPI students, so we call this total advantage. By subtracting the rates of low SES NHPI students from high SES NHPI students, we were able to isolate and calculate economic advantage in both proficiency rates and disciplinary data, while minimizing the cultural differences. Conversely, by subtracting the proficiency rate of high SES NHPI students from high SES non-NHPI students, OHE was able to isolate and calculate the impact of cultural dissonance and minimize economic advantage. This became the OHE cultural dissonance formula. This formula provides quantitative evidence that the achievement gap cannot be attributed to economic advantage alone, and the data suggests that cultural dissonance has a greater influence on language arts and math proficiency than economic advantage. When presented with specific historical context, OHE's formula can be applied to various types of student outcome data to offer non-deficit and non-eugenic based analyses. Returning to our deck of cards, we can illustrate for our students that the process that severed can also reconnect us. So now we understand why, what, and where. But how do we get Hawaiian education for all teachers and learners back on course to a desired futurity? By finding our curriculum as secondary content within traditional sources of knowledge production and intentionally providing opportunities for teachers and students to nalu, hana, malama, and awamo, all stakeholders can experience ha outcomes. Before the COVID pandemic, our director, Keali'i Sang, challenged our office to engage strength, place, and culture-based education within our ohana to extend learning back to and from the home. She wanted us to model the types of P4 we wanted to see in our schools. The following video was my family's journey of a'o and helped me to experience the question, how does strength, place, and culture-based education look, smell, taste, sound, and feel like in Hawaii?
Aloha. We are the Kukahiko Ohana. In March of 2020, while my two oldest sons were visiting from the continent on spring break, the COVID pandemic forced us together in our hale in Lapahoehoe, Mamoku o Keawe. My wife is Kalihua and I am Keali'i, and we are two totally opposites, desperately hoping that love is enough, and trying to figure out how to survive this pandemic as a family unit. In response, we decided to take on a family project to convert the overgrown and unused land on our property into a mala. My oldest son, Makoa, is a 24-year-old big city kid who recently graduated with his MBA from St. John's University in New York. My second son, Keikoa, is 23 and is a few courses shy of graduating from Northern Arizona University. He had brought his girlfriend Scarlett to meet us over the spring break, so she's here as well. My third son, Kalimamo Oka'ala, is 21 and was studying Ike Hawaii at UH Manoa, but left college to come home and work. My fourth son, Kale Vaihona Halia, is going to be a sophomore at Kamehameha Hawaii and wants to play college football. My daughter, Kauilani o Vaipunale, is a 1-year-old, and it amazes me to see how observant she is and how fast she learns. Before I got started, I asked each family member to consider 3 questions to guide our work. The first question, what do I need to know, prepare, or collect? For me, I taught the boys an oli specific to Laupahoehoe. We went to the point and chanted together acknowledging our kapuna and letting them know that the pohaku that we would borrow would stay in Laupahoehoe and that they would one day naturally return. We needed to find niho, or foundation stones. These are the ones that we would place 6 inches into the ground to form the solid base of the entire structure. The kukulu, or the 2 exteriors of the wall, are built upwards from this foundation. We needed to collect haka, or the smaller pohaku, that are wedged between the larger pohaku of the kukulu to further solidify the structure, and papale, which are large flat stones used to cap the tops of the walls. The second question, what is expected of me or my family? We knew that we need to occupy our workspaces with good intentions and build a reciprocal relationship with the Aina. That meant that we had to till the soil and make mulch to create a vitamin-rich environment for the kalo. And we had to plant vetiver in the soil around the mala to prevent erosion because we had dug out all the guinea grass. The third question, why is this knowledge important? For me, this knowledge is important because the COVID pandemic exposed the fragility of our dependence on a specialized capitalist economy, processed foods, and an educational model that simply replicates an unsustainable reality. My son and many of our extended family members were laid off by the hotels. Trips to the grocery stores are now health risks. All of our family members have been gaining weight during quarantine, and meanwhile, a false sense of meritocracy and individualism tear our home apart from the inside. During the work, I asked each family member to consider 3 questions to improve our work. 1, what are the skills I need to complete the task? Well, we got the huli and the vetiver from our friend Katyana, Hekumo Ame Mahiai Oya. Katyana showed us how to plant them and how to make sure that the huli and the vetiver were appropriately spaced apart. We also needed to create steps and a pathway to the mala, which we decided to build with bamboo. The second question, what are the things I need to focus on during my tasks, and what is my kuleana? Like the niho stones, the huli needed to be planted 6 to 8 inches deep since the kalo grows upwards, which allowed room for the kalo to grow while being sheltered and protected. At first, working together was difficult, and each son wanted to develop skills that made them unique and gave them a sense of kuleana. I took it upon myself to make sure that each had space to grow like the kalo and the vetiver, allowing each to develop their own sense of kuleana to help the ohana while we malama each other. The third question, what unforeseen challenges or obstacles exist that I need to overcome in order to complete the task or activity? For me, the family dynamics during quarantine was the most challenging. Everyone in the household was uncomfortable with transitioning from individual freedoms and liberties to communal values, relationships, and responsibilities. My wife and I argued. Our opposite characteristics and personalities that usually complemented each other now clashed as her loving and forgiving nature grated against the ultimatums I demanded of the boys.
After the work, I asked each family member to consider 3 questions to learn from our work. What concept, ideas, and/or specific places to Hawaii were important in understanding this learning task or activity? E opu ali'i, have the heart of a chief, have the kindness, generosity, and even temper of a chief. Growing up, Keali'i was raised by an iron fist, but he learned that his children will model his actions, not his words. And so his inability to be patient, loving, and even-tempered had created a cycle of contempt that had impacted our ability to a'o, or learn together. The Olelo No'ea reminds us that the standards of excellence are embedded in our genealogies and that our greatest failure has been to measure our children by standards that were never our own, standards that measure what they are not instead of who they are. 2. How would I perform the task differently in the future? E ho'omanawa nui, be patient. I thought after 3 weeks the vetiver was dead and would not grow, but Makoa and the baby took it upon themselves to water the plants every day. Soon the vetiver and kalo flourished. In the same way, I thought my boys were lazy and selfish, but all have stepped up and continue to contribute to the needs of the mala, our hale, and the mastery of their own special gifts. 3rd, what are the things I need to master before I'm able to teach this activity or task to others, and how do I master these things? Nawai ho'i ko ole o ke aka mai. He ala hele I ma'a I ka hele ia e o umau makua. Who would not be wise on a path walked upon by parents and ancestors? I need to learn and practice the ways of our kupuna so that my ohana and I can think and dream in a reality of our own making. This is the only way we can be free to live with our hands turned down in the mastery of crafts determined by our own sense of kuleana. The ha'ina. The mo'olelo of this wahi is linked to our ohana story. For example, when Kamehameha heard that his ali'i, Lononuiakea of Laupahoehoe, was killed by Pina'au and Kauwehanehane, Kamehameha sent Makoa, his fastest messenger. Makoa went to deliver the message to the ali'i in Laupahoehoe, but when they heard the message, both men scoffed and insulted Kamehameha. Makoa swiftly and skillfully vanquished both ali'i. Makoa then returned to Kamehameha in Kohala to report the events that transpired, and he would eventually go on to lead the Second War of Laupahoehoe. This name story connected my oldest son, Makoa, to this place, and for the last month, my big city son has been mentoring high school students in a summer business internship that connects Hamakua students to local small businesses. He teaches social media marketing to the interns, who in turn help these small mom-and-pop businesses thrive during the COVID times. Kekoa's roots have also deepened. He does not want to go back to Arizona and plans to finish his studies here in Hawaii while working. He enjoys construction and is pursuing ways to enhance his experience so that he can eventually help build a home for our ohana. Kalei Mamo Ka'ala is also flexing his wings and honing his other skills during the quarantine while the hotels remain closed. But he loves working in the aina and pampering his little sister. Toby continues to prepare for a football season that may not happen this coming fall, but we believe his training has become a way of life for him, a process that has given him a sense of confidence on the football field that will one day transfer to a passion beyond athletics. And Kau'i. Kau'i has adopted the kuleana to feed the dogs every morning and water the plants. Even as a toddler, it seems that kuleana plays an important role to her identity and the value we attribute to her contributions to our family.
This was much more than an activity to build a mala. With the ike of our kupuna as our niho stones, Kalihua and I can be the kukulu, two sides of the same rock wall. We have confidence that if we place each stone with the intention to support our ohana and lahui, the rocks of this aina will sustain us. As part of the Office of Hawaiian Education, we are developing educational practices, projects, programs, and policies that seek to reconnect Haido stakeholders to traditional sources of knowledge production. OHE works towards a sustainable model of education that extends learning to and from the home and requires each of us to model our personal and professional environments as a realization of this desired futurity. You are welcome to use this AO log meant for both teachers and learners and can be downloaded for free as a resource on OHE's Hub. Your ability to connect yourself to traditional sources of knowledge production and invite your students to AO in those educational spaces empower all stakeholders to develop an intentionality in both teaching and learning. We not only honor and acknowledge the ike that exists within our homes and communities, but we increase our capacity to access content and relationships that help us to develop as both teachers and learners. You may not be able to change the economic challenges that your students carry with them, but you can change the singularity of their educational experiences and offer strength, place, and culture-based educational P4 that mitigate cultural dissonance outcomes. He ike ana ya ikapono. One has seen the right thing to do and has done it. Basically, if we know better, we got to do better. Being neutral is not neutral. It is a conscious decision to do nothing. Our work at the Office of Hawaiian Education uses interest convergence to enact educational practices, projects, programs, and policies to recalibrate and realign the trajectory of Hawaiian education to a desired futurity. The E3 policy of Nahopena A'o and the Ha outcomes, and the Haido 2020 to 2030 strategic plan, or the Promise Plan, provide the interest convergence to polarize stakeholders around values that they already have and believe in, and make it uncomfortable for them to stay in neutral spaces. Mahalo for your time, and I hope that some of these concepts resonate with you and that you will engage OHE and other educational stakeholders to help us right this ship and get our va'a back on course. Until then, aloha.